What if I told you that the government once poisoned thousands of its own citizens? A hotel was literally built as a killing machine, and a town has been on fire underground for over 60 years and nobody can stop it. And none of that is even in the top 10 of this list. We found 111 urban legends that people laughed at for years. Turns out every single one of them was horrifyingly real, and a few of them will make you question everything you were taught in school. Stick around, because number 7 will genuinely make your jaw drop. And if you already feel that weird feeling in your stomach right now, smash that like button. So this reaches someone who still thinks they know American history, because after this video, they won't. 1. There is a town in Pennsylvania called Centralia, and it has been sitting on top of a literal fire since 1962, and nobody has put it out yet. A coal mine caught fire underground, and instead of dealing with it like normal people, the government just said good luck, and slowly relocated everyone over the next few decades. The ground cracks open, smoke pours out of the roads, and the temperature underground hits 900 degrees. Centralia is basically hell with a zip code, and it is still burning right now as you read this. 2. The CIA once ran a secret program called MK Ultra, where government agents walked up to completely normal American citizens and slipped them LSD without saying a single word about it. Bartenders, mental patients, prisoners, and regular folks on the street were all dosed just so scientists could take notes on what happened next. Could be one man jumped out of a window. Others never psychologically recovered. The CIA eventually said whoops, shredded most of the files, and the program ran for over a decade before anyone outside found out. 3. Body snatchers were not just a scary movie concept because in the 1800s, medical schools in America were so desperate for corpses that they literally paid criminal gangs to dig up fresh graves overnight and deliver the bodies by morning. Families started burying their loved ones in iron coffins with locks just to stop it. Some gangs got so good at it, they skipped the waiting part and just started murdering people directly. The whole anatomy education system in America was basically funded by grave robbery, and nobody in charge seemed too bothered about it. 4. H. Holmes was a Chicago doctor who built an entire hotel specifically designed to murder people inside it, and somehow got away with it for years. The place had gas pipes running into guest rooms, secret chutes dropping bodies into a basement crematorium, and doors that locked only from the outside. He rented rooms during the 1893 World's Fair when Chicago was packed with tourists, and nobody asked any questions. He eventually confessed to 27 murders, but investigators believe the real number was much higher, and the hotel just kept running like a normal business. 5. The Tuskegee experiment sounds like something a villain makes up, but the US government actually ran it for 40 years starting in 1932. Doctors enrolled 400 black men in Alabama who had syphilis, told them they were receiving free healthcare, and then deliberately gave them nothing while watching the disease destroy their bodies. Penicillin became widely available in the 1940s, and doctors still refused to treat them just to keep the study going. And the experiment only stopped in 1972 because a whistleblower leaked it to the press, and the entire country had a very uncomfortable moment of silence. 6. In the 1920s, Americans were buying toothpaste with actual radium in it because companies marketed radiation as a health supplement, and people believed them completely. The brand Doramad advertised that radioactive toothpaste made teeth sparkle and gums stronger, while customers were essentially brushing their mouths with nuclear material twice a day. Meanwhile, a factory worker named Eben Byers drank radium water daily because his doctor recommended it, and his jaw literally dissolved off his face. The Wall Street Journal ran the headline, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off, and somehow that did not immediately stop sales." 7. In 1872, a ship called the Mary Celeste was found, floating perfectly in the Atlantic Ocean with no crew anywhere on board, and absolutely nobody has explained it since. The sails were set, food was still sitting on the table, the cargo was untouched, and the captain's logbook had normal entries right up until the day before discovery. No signs of struggle, no blood, no damage, and the lifeboat was gone, but nobody in it was ever found. 10 people vanished in calm weather with no distress signal, and the ship just kept sailing itself like everything was completely fine. 8. Operation Northwoods was a real plan drawn up by U.S. military officials in 1962 that proposed staging fake terrorist attacks on American citizens, and then blaming Cuba to justify going to war. The plan included blowing up a drone ship, shooting down a fake passenger plane, and having CIA agents dress up as Cubans to commit violence on American streets. The document was signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and sent to President Kennedy, who immediately rejected it. It was declassified in 1997, and Americans collectively stared at the paper for a long time, trying to figure out what to say. 9. Deep underneath a luxury resort called the Greenbrier in West Virginia, the U.S. government secretly hollowed out a giant bunker and hid it there for 30 years without telling a single guest who was sleeping directly above it. The bunker was built to house all of Congress during a nuclear war with enough food, medical supplies, and communication equipment to run the government underground for months. Maids cleaned hotel rooms upstairs while senators unknowingly vacationed on top of their own apocalypse shelter. A journalist finally exposed it in 1992, and the government immediately decommissioned it because the secret was the whole point. 10. A man named Bob Ruff actually lived inside the tunnel system beneath Disneyland for several months without a single employee noticing he was there. He accessed the underground utility corridors that staff used to move around the park invisibly and basically set up a quiet little life underneath the happiest place on earth. He ate from the park, slept in unused spaces, and blended in whenever he surfaced. Disney security only caught on after months, and the company stayed very quiet about the whole situation because nothing says Magic Kingdom like a secret tunnel squatter living rent-free under Cinderella's castle. 11. Radium was being dropped into everything Americans consumed in the early 1900s, including drinking water, chocolate bars, and fancy spa treatments because companies genuinely marketed radiation as a wellness product. A wealthy socialite named Eben Byers drank multiple bottles of radium water every single day for years because his doctor told him it would boost his energy. His bones slowly disintegrated, his skull collapsed, and he lost so much body mass doctors barely recognized him. He died weighing under 90 pounds with most of his face gone, and the radium water company kept selling the product for 2 more years after his very public death. 12. A woman in St. Petersburg, Florida named Mary Reeser was found in 1951 burned down to a pile of ash and one undamaged foot, while everything around her in the apartment was completely untouched. The coroner filed it officially as spontaneous human combustion because there was no external fire source, no accelerant, and no logical explanation for how a human body reached cremation temperatures without burning the carpet underneath her chair. The FBI got involved, sent samples to labs, and the official conclusion was essentially we have no idea. Her armchair burned, she burned, and the wall 2 feet away was completely fine. 13. In 2012, a small town in New York called Leroy watched in total confusion as 18 teenage girls suddenly developed violent, uncontrollable facial tics and verbal outbursts with absolutely no medical explanation connecting any of them. Doctors ran every test available, checked the water, checked the school building, and checked environmental factors, and found nothing. Neurologists called it mass psychogenic illness, which is the scientific way of saying the brain scared itself into physical symptoms. Parents demanded answers, media flooded the town, and one by one the symptoms eventually disappeared, just as mysteriously as they had started, leaving everyone completely baffled. 14. After the Civil War left thousands of unidentified and unclaimed bodies across battlefields, the fertilizer industry saw an opportunity and began processing human bones and remains into agricultural fertilizer that was then sold to farms across the American South. Bone meal made from battlefield dead was advertised as premium crop nutrient, and farmers bought it without knowing or sometimes without asking too many questions about where exactly it came from. The practice was not illegal, barely regulated, and openly discussed in agricultural journals of the time. American soil in several southern states was literally enriched with the remains of soldiers from both sides of the war. 15. A Scottish surgeon named Robert Liston was famous in the 1840s for operating so fast with a saw that spectators timed him with pocket watches, but speed came at a brutal cost. During one operation, he accidentally amputated his assistant's fingers along with the patient's leg. The patient died from infection. The assistant died from infection, and a spectator in the front row died of shock on the spot. Just from watching. That is 3 deaths from one surgery, giving it a rumored 300% mortality rate, which is a statistic that should not mathematically be possible for a single operation, but somehow Robert Liston achieved it. 16. In Strasbourg. In 1518, a woman named Frau Trophea walked into the street and started dancing by herself and could not stop. Why, within a week, 34 people had joined her, and within a month, over 400 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets day and night without rest. Physicians at the time prescribed more dancing as the cure, and even hired musicians to keep the beat going, which made everything dramatically worse. People danced until their feet bled, until their hearts gave out, and some actually died from exhaustion. No virus was found, no poison was identified, and nobody has fully explained what happened to Strasbourg that summer. 17. The Philadelphia experiment is one of America's most persistent conspiracy theories, claiming the U.S. Navy made a warship called the USS Eldridge completely invisible in 1943 using electromagnetic fields. But what makes this one uncomfortable is that declassified Navy documents confirmed unusual and highly classified radar invisibility experiments were actively conducted during that exact period. Official records deny the specific story, but acknowledge that something experimental was happening on that ship that the government did not want discussed. Sailors who served on the Eldridge reported strange experiences, and several made claims for decades that were never fully addressed by the Navy. 18. In a small Hungarian village in the 1910s, a midwife named Julia Fazekas began quietly supplying local women with arsenic extracted from flypaper and teaching them how to use it on their husbands. What started with one woman poisoning one difficult husband slowly became a village-wide operation where women poisoned fathers, brothers, sick relatives, and anyone considered a burden. Over 300 people were killed across the region before investigators got suspicious. When police finally arrived, the women were so calm and organized about the whole thing that detectives initially could not believe what they were uncovering underneath a completely ordinary farming community. 19. NASA had one job with the original moon landing tapes, which was to not record over them, and they recorded over them. Saying the original high-quality footage of the Apollo 11 moon landing was stored on magnetic reels. And sometime in the 1970s and 1980s, NASA reused those tapes for satellite data. Because storage was expensive and nobody put a sticky note on the most important video in human history saying please do not erase. The footage seen today is a copy taken from a broadcast monitor. The best recording of mankind's greatest achievement was accidentally wiped by the same agency that pulled it off. 20. Sarah Winchester was the widow of the rifle company Fortune, and she became so convinced that the ghosts of everyone killed by Winchester rifles were haunting her that she hired construction workers to build her California mansion continuously for 38 years without stopping. The house ended up with stairs that walk directly into ceilings, your doors that open onto 2-story drops, windows built into floors, and chimneys that stop just before reaching the roof. Workers built around the clock even on Christmas because Sarah believed if construction stopped, she would die. She died in 1922, and the house still stands today with 160 rooms and 0 logical floor plan. 21. The city of Cahokia in Illinois was once one of the largest cities on Earth with a population bigger than London in the year 1100, and then every single person who lived there simply vanished without leaving a note or a forwarding address. Archaeologists have found massive ceremonial mounds, evidence of sophisticated agriculture, complex trade networks, and thousands of homes, but zero explanation for why everyone packed up and disappeared around 1350. No war evidence, no mass graves, no disease trail. An entire thriving metropolis just quietly emptied out one day, and the Mississippi River kept flowing like nothing unusual had happened at all. 22. Sin-eating was a completely real profession in rural England and Wales, where a poor person was hired to show up at a funeral, lean over the corpse and eat bread and salt placed directly on the dead body to absorb all the sins of the deceased into themselves. The sin-eater was paid a few coins, handed some ale, and then chased out of town immediately after because everyone believed they were now spiritually contaminated. These people lived as total outcasts, avoided by their entire communities, absorbing other people's spiritual debt for pocket change. It was considered a necessary service and a completely miserable way to make a living. 23. Megalodon was a prehistoric shark, the size of a school bus that scientists have officially classified as extinct but fossilized teeth from this creature keep washing up on beaches, and some of those teeth have been dated to only 10,000 years old, which, in geological terms, is basically last Tuesday. Marine biologists point out that over 80% of the deep ocean remains completely unexplored, and Megalodon preferred deep water hunting grounds. No confirmed living specimen has been found, but oceanographers have recorded unidentified acoustic signatures from the deep ocean that do not match any known species, and everyone involved quietly changed the subject afterward. 24. Lobotomies were performed on American patients, including children, as young as 4 years old, using a literal ice pick inserted through the eye socket and wiggled around to sever brain connections. And the doctor who popularized this procedure, Walter Freeman, performed over 3,400 of them, traveling state to state in a van he called the Lobotomobile. He operated in state fairs, mental hospitals, and private homes with no surgical suite and minimal sterilization. Patients were awake during the procedure with only electroconvulsive shock as sedation. Freeman genuinely believed he was helping people and received awards for his work before the medical community. Eventually, and very belatedly, told him to stop. 25. During World War II, Japan's Unit 731 operated a biological warfare program in China, where scientists dropped bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over civilian cities, deliberately infected prisoners with cholera, anthrax, and typhoid, and then performed live vivisections on conscious human beings to observe how diseases progressed in real time. An estimated 400,000 people died as a result of these programs. After the war, the United States government secretly granted immunity to every Unit 731 scientist in exchange for their research data, meaning not a single person was prosecuted, and the findings were quietly absorbed into American biological research programs. 26. Heaven's Gate was a California cult that believed aliens were coming to collect their souls via a spaceship hiding behind the Hale-Bopp comet. And to prepare for this cosmic pickup, 8 male members voluntarily underwent surgical castration because the cult leader Marshall Applewhite taught that physical gender was an obstacle to alien ascension. In 1997, all 39 members put on matching Nike sneakers, covered themselves with purple shrouds, and took fatal doses of phenobarbital mixed with applesauce. Authorities found them in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, looking completely peaceful and organized, as though they had simply sat down to wait for a bus that was running slightly late. 27. In the 1950s, the U.S. government was detonating nuclear bombs in the Nevada desert, just 65 miles from Las Vegas, and instead of telling people to run in the opposite direction, the city leaned into it completely. Hotels advertised rooftop atomic viewing parties, casinos handed out atomic cocktails, and tourists drove out specifically to watch mushroom clouds rise over the desert while eating breakfast. The Atomic Energy Commission distributed cards showing safe viewing distances that were optimistic at best and completely fictional at worst. Downwind communities in Nevada and Utah later reported cancer rates so elevated that residents became known simply as downwinders and filed lawsuits for decades. 28. A mortician in Philippi, West Virginia named Carl Tanzler developed what can only be described as an extremely alarming attachment to the deceased women in his care, and over a 30-year period kept preserved female corpses in his home, dressed them in clothes, gave them names, and arranged them in domestic settings throughout his house as though they were family members. Neighbors described him as quiet and kept to himself, which is doing a tremendous amount of work as a character description. He was eventually discovered, briefly investigated, and faced minimal legal consequences because the laws at the time were genuinely not equipped for the specific situation Carl Tanzler had created. 29. An original Coca-Cola contained actual cocaine because the recipe developed by John Pemberton in 1886 included coca leaf extract, which delivered a mild cocaine dose in every glass, and the company openly marketed it as a brain tonic and intellectual beverage for children and adults alike. Soda fountains prescribed it for headaches, fatigue, and nervousness, and doctors recommended it to patients. The cocaine was eventually removed in 1903 not because of health concerns, but primarily because of racial anxieties about black men consuming cocaine in the South. The drink kept its coca leaf extract after removing the active cocaine component and technically still uses decocainized coca leaves today. 30. A woman in Ohio in the 1980s named Lucille Ball, not the actress, reported to authorities that she was receiving radio transmissions directly through her dental fillings and hearing voices and music playing inside her head with no external source. Investigators initially dismissed her as unstable, but a radio engineer who examined her fillings discovered that the specific metal composition and cavity geometry had created an accidental rectifying circuit capable of picking up AM radio frequencies. Her teeth were functioning as a primitive radio receiver. The fillings were replaced, the voices stopped, and the woman was completely vindicated but had spent months being told she was imagining the whole thing. 31. The Cahaba River in Alabama runs bright red every single year, and locals have been quietly freaked out about it for generations. But scientists finally traced the cause to an ancient bloom of bacteria called Chromobacterium violaceum that predates human civilization entirely. The bacteria activates seasonally, turning the water a deep blood red color that looks exactly like something a special effects team would design for a horror movie. The organisms have been living in that river system for millions of years completely unbothered by everything that has happened above the surface, including the entire rise and fall of human history, happening right next to their perfectly red river. 32. Underneath the streets of Paris, there are approximately 200 miles of tunnel networks lined with the carefully stacked bones and skulls of over 6 million people, and tourists who wander off the official guided path have genuinely never been found again. The catacombs were created in the 1700s when Paris cemeteries overflowed so severely that bodies were contaminating the drinking water, and city officials decided the logical solution was to move everyone underground in decorative bone arrangements. Explorer groups called cataphiles still illegally navigate the unsanctioned tunnels today, and French police have a special unit dedicated entirely to catching people living their best lives surrounded by 6 million skeletons underneath a city famous for romance. 33. In the early 1900s, American doctors were prescribing heroin as the medically recommended cure for morphine addiction because the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, the same company that makes aspirin, marketed heroin as a completely safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine and sent samples to physicians across the country. Doctors who had morphine-addicted patients switched them to heroin with total confidence, and those patients became heroin-addicted patients instead. When heroin addiction then became a crisis, cocaine was briefly recommended as a treatment for that, and the entire American medical establishment spent about 30 years enthusiastically replacing one catastrophic addiction with a worse one while writing it up in respected journals. 34. Other Unit 731 was a covert Japanese biological warfare unit operating in Manchuria during World War II, where scientists conducted experiments on live prisoners, including freezing limbs and then thawing them to study frostbite progression, placing people in pressure chambers until their eyes exploded, and performing surgical procedures on fully conscious patients with no anesthesia purely to observe real-time physiological responses. The unit operated with full military approval and processed thousands of prisoners. When the war ended, American intelligence officials made a secret deal granting every scientist involved complete immunity from war crimes, prosecution, in exchange for handing over all experimental data, which was then quietly filed into U.S. military research archives. 35. The Jonestown Massacre in 1978, where 909 members of the People's Temple died in Guyana, drinking cyanide-laced punch, was not a spontaneous event because survivors confirmed that cult leader Jim Jones had been running rehearsals called White Nights for years, where members were woken in the middle of the night, handed cups of liquid, and told to drink it as a loyalty test. Everyone drank. Jones would then announce it was just a test and congratulate them on their devotion. By the time the real poisoning happened, members had practiced compliance so many times that the psychological conditioning made resistance nearly impossible for most people in that compound. 36. Beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, the U.S. government bought an entire mountain, hired engineers to hollow out the interior, and constructed NORAD, a fully operational military command center built on giant springs to survive nuclear shockwaves, surrounded by 2,000 feet of solid granite on every side. The facility tracks every aircraft, missile, and satellite over North America in real time and has been continuously operational since 1966. During the Cold War, the American public was told very little about what was inside that mountain, and the workers who built it signed agreements that made discussing the project essentially illegal for decades after construction was completed. 37. Nanny Doss was a grandmother from Oklahoma who spent 20 years casually poisoning husbands, children, her own mother, 2 sisters, and a mother-in-law with rat poison slipped into food and was never suspected because she smiled constantly. She loved romance novels and seemed like the most cheerful woman in any room she entered. She killed at least 11 people, and possibly more, and in every case death was attributed to natural causes because nobody looked twice at a giggling grandmother with a flower garden. When she was finally caught in 1954, she laughed during the interrogation, complained that investigators had found her diary, and became genuinely famous as the Giggling Granny. 38. In 1970, a Soviet surgeon named Vladimir Demikov successfully transplanted a second living head onto a dog, and the resulting 2-headed animal survived for 8 days, with both heads independently responsive, both sets of eyes tracking movement, and both mouths attempting to drink milk when offered. The experiment was not hidden. It was published and photographed and distributed internationally. American neurosurgeon Robert White read the research and used it as the foundation for his own work, attempting a full human head transplant. Demikov performed over 22-headed dog experiments total and considered them a technical success, despite the fact that they produced 2-headed dogs, which most people felt raised additional questions. 39. A lighthouse keeper named Thomas Griffith Hicks on a remote Welsh island reported in 1900 that a massive dark shape rose from the water and consumed both of his assistant keepers during a storm. And when the supply boat arrived weeks later, they found him alone, incoherent, and completely unable to give a rational account of what happened. Now, both assistants were logged officially as lost at sea, which was the Victorian era's way of closing a file without answering any of the actual questions in it. The lighthouse, Flannan Isle, became one of Britain's most discussed maritime mysteries, and no physical evidence explaining the disappearance of those 2 men has ever been produced. 40. Pompeii was not destroyed by lava flows as most Americans picture it, because the actual killer was a pyroclastic surge, a 500-degree wall of superheated gas and ash that traveled at hurricane speed and vaporized every living person in the city within 4 minutes of arrival, leaving their bodies frozen mid-motion in whatever they happened to be doing when the mountain decided it was done being a mountain. People were found playing dice, eating lunch, and sleeping. One man was found with his hand over his face, not from lava, but from a heat blast so fast and total that his last gesture became a permanent plaster cast that tourists photograph on weekdays. 41. Victorian families across England and America regularly photographed their deceased relatives posed as though they were still alive because photography was so expensive and rare that for many families the funeral was the only opportunity they ever had to get a picture of someone they loved. Photographers developed wire stands and posing clamps to hold bodies upright at dining tables, in chairs, and standing beside living family members with eyes sometimes painted onto the closed lids to create the appearance of alertness. The practice was called post-mortem photography and was considered a completely normal and even loving tradition rather than the deeply unsettling tableau it appears to be when discovered unexpectedly in an antique shop. 42. The entire population of Whittier, Alaska, roughly 200 people, lives inside a single 14-story concrete building called Begich Towers, and never needs to go outside because the building contains apartments, a school, a church, a medical clinic, a convenience store, and the local jail, all connected by an underground tunnel to the town hall next door. The weather outside is so brutal for most of the year that residents have simply decided the outdoors is optional. Children grow up, attend school, buy groceries, and theoretically get arrested all within the same structure. Outsiders who visit describe it as either the coziest or most claustrophobic concept they have ever encountered, depending entirely on their personality type. 43. A man in New Mexico in the 1940s was shot in the head during a bar dispute, and the bullet lodged so deeply and in such a neurologically quiet region of his brain that he experienced zero symptoms, never sought treatment, never mentioned it to doctors, and lived a completely normal life for 50 more years until an unrelated scan on his deathbed revealed a bullet that had been sitting inside his skull since the Truman administration. Doctors who reviewed the case noted the bullet had traveled to a location that avoided every major structure and essentially parked itself in the one spot in the human brain where a bullet could theoretically do the least damage. 44. American prisoners of war held in Korea during the 1950s were subjected to systematic psychological manipulation by Chinese and North Korean captors involving sleep deprivation, isolation, forced confession writing, and ideological indoctrination so thorough and effective that when the war ended in 1953, a significant number of American soldiers refused repatriation and chose to remain in communist countries. 21 Americans declined to come home. The U.S. military was so disturbed by this outcome that it immediately launched classified research into resistance training and psychological conditioning that directly shaped interrogation policies and prisoner of war preparation programs used by the American military for the next several decades. 45. In 1844, in a convent in France, a nun began meowing like a cat for no identifiable reason, and within days, every other nun in the building had joined her. And the meowing spread from that convent to others across the region, with entire communities of nuns meowing in unison for hours at a time until authorities threatened them with physical punishment if they did not stop. Historians classify this as a case of mass psychogenic illness, where extreme stress, repression, and the highly communal nature of convent life created conditions where one person's unusual behavior triggered an unstoppable psychological chain reaction that traveled across institutional walls like a virus made entirely of cat sounds. 46. American diplomatic staff stationed in Havana, Cuba, beginning in 2016, started reporting sudden onset hearing loss, piercing sounds, eye pressure in their heads, and severe cognitive impairment that doctors eventually linked to what became known as Havana syndrome. The symptoms spread to U.S. embassy staff in China, Russia, Austria, and dozens of other countries, affecting hundreds of government employees. Investigations pointed toward directed microwave energy as a possible cause, suggesting a foreign power was essentially aiming an invisible weapon at American diplomats on foreign soil. Multiple government reports were produced. Multiple agencies investigated, and as of today, the source and perpetrator remain officially and somewhat embarrassingly unconfirmed. 47. So, a British doctor named John Bodkin Adams practiced medicine in Eastbourne, England during the 1950s and is estimated to have killed up to 250 elderly patients by injecting lethal doses of morphine and heroin into their veins, often after being named in their wills, and operated without serious suspicion for over a decade because he was charming, well-liked, and nobody wanted to believe a cheerful family doctor was systematically ending the lives of wealthy retirees. He was eventually tried for murder, acquitted due to insufficient evidence, and returned to practicing medicine for another 20 years. Scotland Yard later acknowledged the investigation had been deeply flawed and possibly deliberately obstructed. 48. Scientists at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia in the 1990s created a genetically modified mouse that could completely regenerate damaged organs, including heart tissue, and quietly shelved the research because the implications of an organism that could regrow its own heart raised more questions than the scientific community was prepared to answer publicly at the time. The mouse strain, called the MRL mouse, healed wounds with zero scarring and repaired damage that would be permanent in any normal mammal. Follow-up studies confirmed the findings were reproducible, and researchers acknowledged the genetic pathway existed in humans in a dormant state, which is the kind of sentence that deserves significantly more public attention than it received. 49. In 2011, a family in Gary, Indiana, reported that their children were speaking in voices that were not their own, walking up walls and being thrown across rooms by invisible forces. And what makes this particular case unusual is that 3 separate responding police officers, including a veteran captain, filed official, written reports stating they personally witnessed a child walk up a wall and onto the ceiling while in their presence. The case was investigated by the Department of Child Services, reviewed by medical professionals, and eventually referred to a Catholic priest. The family relocated, The children were examined by psychiatric professionals, and the police reports were never officially retracted or explained away. 50. The Salton Sea in Southern California was accidentally created in 1905 when an irrigation canal broke and flooded a desert basin for 2 years straight. And for a brief period in the 1950s and 60s, it was a glamorous resort destination attracting celebrities and tourists from Los Angeles. Then the water began concentrating salt and agricultural runoff. The fish died by the billions. The beaches turned white with their bones, and the smell became so overwhelming that property values collapsed entirely. Today, the Salton Sea is a toxic, shrinking wasteland with dead tilapia crunching underfoot, abandoned yacht clubs rotting on the shore, and a persistent agricultural chemical stench that carries for miles in every direction. Thus, 51. A human fat rendered from executed prisoners in 18th century Europe was sold openly in public markets as a medicinal product that apothecaries recommended for joint pain, skin conditions, and wound healing. And customers bought it without significant moral objection, because the executed were considered to have forfeited all claims to bodily dignity the moment the sentence was carried out. Hangman's grease, as it was commonly called, was considered especially potent if taken from a healthy young person. And some European executioners supplemented their income considerably by selling the byproducts of their official work to waiting pharmacists who had placed orders in advance before the execution was even scheduled. 52. Saturtopsis is a species of jellyfish roughly the size of a fingernail that has solved the problem of death by simply refusing to participate in it, because when this organism reaches the end of its natural life cycle, instead of dying, it reverts its own cells back to their earliest state and starts the entire aging process over again from scratch. Scientists confirmed this biological immortality in peer-reviewed research and have been studying the mechanism ever since, because the cellular process the jellyfish uses to reset itself bears enough similarity to human cellular regeneration that marine biologists and oncologists have started attending the same conferences and having very intense conversations. 53. In the 1800s, the standard medical treatment for women diagnosed with hysteria, a neurasthenia or general unhappiness, was the rest cure, a regime prescribed by neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell that confined women to bed for weeks or months, at a time with no books, no writing, no visitors, no conversation, and no physical activity of any kind, on the theory that mental distress was caused by women doing too much thinking. Patients were fed, kept still, and told recovery required complete intellectual shutdown. Writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman received this treatment, nearly lost her mind from the isolation, and then wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a horror story about a woman driven insane by being locked in a room and told to rest. 54. The Bataan Death March. In 1942, forced approximately 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war to walk 65 miles through the Philippine jungle in brutal heat with no food, almost no water, and Japanese guards under orders that anyone who fell behind or collapsed from exhaustion was to be bayoneted on the spot and left where they dropped. Prisoners who stopped to help a fallen comrade were killed alongside them. The march took nearly 2 weeks, and thousands died before reaching the destination camp, where conditions were so catastrophic that thousands more died in the months that followed. American military leadership knew the march had happened, and the full details were suppressed from the public for over a year. 55. In the small town of Leroy, New York in 2012, 18 teenagers, most of them girls, suddenly developed identical symptoms of uncontrollable facial tics, verbal outbursts, and involuntary arm movements with no shared exposure to any toxin, its virus or physical cause, that investigators could identify after months of testing the school, the water supply, and the surrounding environment. Neurologists diagnosed the cluster as mass psychogenic illness, and the school district spent enormous resources proving the building was physically safe. While the actual explanation that human beings can unconsciously transmit stress responses through social proximity received considerably less attention because it was harder to fix with an inspection report and a letter to concerned parents. 56. The FBI opened a file on Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963 and spent years wiretapping his phones, bugging his hotel rooms, surveilling his associates, and compiling a dossier designed to destroy his reputation And in 1964, an anonymous letter was mailed directly to King from an FBI operative that included recordings of his private conversations and ended with an explicit suggestion that he should take his own life before the recordings were made public. The letter gave him 34 days. King showed the letter to his wife and colleagues and correctly identified it as coming from the government. The FBI's involvement was confirmed by the Senate Church Committee in 1975, and J. Edgar Hoover was identified as the authorizing official. 57. The Zodiac Killer operated in Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Lai confirmed killing at least 5 people and claiming 37 in taunting letters sent directly to San Francisco newspapers, along with encrypted ciphers that he dared investigators to solve. And one of those ciphers went unsolved for 51 years until a team of amateur code breakers cracked it in 2020, revealing a message where the Zodiac complained about collecting slaves for the afterlife. Despite sending 37 letters, multiple ciphers, fingerprints, and eyewitness descriptions to police across multiple jurisdictions, the Zodiac was never identified, never arrested, and simply stopped communicating in 1974, leaving investigators with an enormous amount of evidence and 0 confirmed suspects. 58. IBM, the American technology company. He supplied Nazi Germany with custom-built Hollerith punch card machines specifically configured to catalog Jewish people, track deportations, and organize concentration camp prisoner data, and continued to service and maintain those machines through subsidiaries throughout the entire duration of the Holocaust. Each concentration camp had its own IBM customer number. IBM's New York headquarters maintained regular contact with its German operations throughout the war, and the machines were so integral to the logistics of the Holocaust that historians have argued the systematic scale of the operation would have been significantly harder to execute without American corporate technology underpinning the administrative infrastructure. 59. A woman in Norfolk, England spent 20 years hearing scratching sounds inside her walls and was repeatedly dismissed by family members who assumed she was imagining things until a contractor opened the walls during a renovation in 2004 and discovered an extraordinary cache of medieval artifacts, including coins, religious objects, ceramic pieces, and preserved documents that had been sealed inside the wall cavity by a monk approximately 800 years earlier. The scratching sound was eventually attributed to the settling and shifting of the artifacts against the wall cavity as temperatures changed seasonally. The woman had been living next to an untouched medieval time capsule for 2 decades while everyone around her suggested she speak to someone about the noises. 60. Sikhatikchan was a coal mining town in Russia's Far East that housed 10,000 people at its peak, and in 1996 following a mine explosion that killed several workers. The Soviet-era subsidies keeping the town economically viable were abruptly cut, and the government gave residents almost no notice before announcing the town was being dissolved. Families left within days, abandoning furniture, food still in refrigerators, children's toys on bedroom floors, school textbooks open on desks, and family photographs on walls because there was no time and no infrastructure to move anything. The buildings have been slowly collapsing for nearly 30 years, and visitors who photograph the town describe an eerie sensation of a life interrupted mid-sentence and never resumed. 61. Victorian-era coffins. Across England were being fitted with small bells attached to strings that ran down into the burial chamber because people were being accidentally buried alive frequently enough that it was considered a legitimate engineering problem worth solving rather than an edge case not worth worrying about. The fear was so widespread, it had a medical term, tapophobia, and Edgar Allan Poe wrote about it repeatedly because it genuinely haunted the public imagination. Waiting mortuaries were built in Germany where bodies were kept above ground with attendants watching for movement before burial was permitted. Several documented cases of people waking inside coffins were recorded by coroners who had to explain what the scratch marks on the lid were from. 62. The first successful full-face transplant was performed in France in 2005 on a woman named Isabelle Denoir who had been mauled by her dog, and when she recovered enough to look in a mirror, she recognized features of the donor, a woman who had died by suicide, from photographs the donor's family had shared with her. Denoir described the experience of seeing a face that was simultaneously hers and someone else's as profoundly disorienting in ways that no psychological preparation had fully equipped her for. She spent the rest of her life on immunosuppressant drugs to prevent rejection, gave interviews about her experience with remarkable openness, and died in 2016 from cancer linked to those same medications. 63. On the My Lai massacre in March 1968, saw American soldiers from Charlie Company enter a Vietnamese village and kill between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians, including women, children, and elderly people over several hours, while superior officers were informed by radio that the operation was proceeding successfully. Soldier Hugh Thompson landed his helicopter between troops and survivors to physically stop the killing and reported the massacre up the chain of command immediately. But the Army covered it up for over a year until investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story in 1969. Only one soldier, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted, and he served 3 years of house arrest before being pardoned, making the entire accountability process a subject of national debate for decades. 64. The serpent-handling churches of Appalachia interpret a passage in the Gospel of Mark as a literal instruction to pick up venomous snakes during worship as proof of divine protection. And congregations in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee have been doing exactly that since the early 1900s, with predictable results, including dozens of documented pastor deaths from rattlesnake and copperhead bites. The practice is illegal in most states, but enforcement is inconsistent, and congregations simply move their services when authorities show interest. Pastors who survive bites consider it confirmation of their faith, and pastors who die from bites are remembered as having died, doing what they believed, and either outcome is interpreted as spiritually meaningful by the congregation. 65. During the Cold War, the U.S. high-dial government transported nuclear weapons through American cities in unmarked vans, driven by plainclothes agents with no military escort, no road closures, and no notification to local authorities, because the entire security strategy relied on nobody knowing what was inside the van rather than on any physical protective measures. This program was called Templex, and documents declassified in the 1990s confirmed that nuclear warheads shared highway lanes with commuters, sat at red lights next to school buses, and were occasionally delayed by ordinary traffic jams. The logic was that an invisible nuclear weapon was safer than a visible one, and for several decades that argument was considered sufficient. 66. A Florida man named Farrell was convicted in 1998 of being a self-identified vampire who had been drinking his girlfriend's blood nightly for 2 years, with her enthusiastic and documented consent, and when investigators asked why he did it. He explained that he was the leader of a vampire clan that had crossed over from a parallel dimension and required blood to maintain his powers, which he demonstrated by hitting himself repeatedly in the head with a beer bottle during the police interview. He was 16 years old, had filed his teeth to points, had recruited other teenagers into the clan, and had driven from Kentucky to Florida specifically to commit the crime he was ultimately convicted for. 67. The Taos hum is a persistent low-frequency sound reported by residents of Taos, New Mexico since the 1990s that has been investigated by Congress, studied by teams from multiple universities, and analyzed by the military, and remains completely unexplained to this day, with only approximately 2% of the population able to hear it at all. Those who hear it describe a diesel engine idling sound that never stops, invades sleep, causes headaches, and in some cases has driven people to relocate entirely. Investigators have ruled out industrial sources, military installations, and geological activity, and the leading current hypothesis involves very low-frequency radio waves interacting with inner ear fluid in a small percentage of people with particular sensitivity. 68. The Love Canal neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York, was built directly on top of 22,000 tons of toxic chemical waste that Hooker Chemical had buried and covered with clay, and sold to the local school board for $1 in 1953 with a liability waiver that the school board signed without fully understanding. A school and hundreds of homes were built on top of the site, and by the 1970s residents were reporting black sludge seeping through basement walls, strange chemical smells, and a neighborhood-wide pattern of miscarriages, birth defects, and cancers. Children in the area were found to have abnormal chromosome damage, and several were born with extra rows of teeth, which local officials initially declined to connect to the ground their houses were sitting on. 69. A 1,000-year-old Buddhist monk was discovered in 2015 inside a golden statue in the Netherlands that had been purchased from a collector and sent for routine CT scanning before restoration work began, and the scan revealed a complete human skeleton sitting in lotus position inside the statue, with all major organs removed and replaced with scrolls covered in ancient Chinese writing. Researchers identified the remains as those of Liu Quan, a Chinese Zen master who died around 1100 AD and had apparently been preserved and encased inside the statue by his followers as an act of veneration that the outside world had simply forgotten about for approximately 900 years until a museum scanner found him. 70. Mercury was the standard prescribed treatment for syphilis across Europe and America for roughly 400 years beginning in the late 1400s, and the treatment involved rubbing mercury directly onto infected skin, inhaling mercury vapors in heated chambers, and in some cases drinking mercury compounds, while physicians monitored symptoms that invariably included the patient's teeth falling out, hair loss, neurological damage, and in significant doses death from mercury poisoning itself. Doctors debated for centuries whether patients were dying from syphilis or from the cure, and continued prescribing it anyway because it was the only option available, and also because stopping would require admitting that 4 centuries of standard medical practice had been making a significant number of patients considerably worse. 71. Area 51 existed as an open secret for decades, with the U.S. government officially denying its existence while thousands of workers commuted there daily on unmarked aircraft from Las Vegas, and neighbors in Nevada watched classified jets perform maneuvers no publicly acknowledged aircraft could explain, and it was not until 2013 that the CIA formally acknowledged the facility existed at all in declassified documents. The files confirmed experimental aircraft programs including the U-2 spy plane and SR-71 Blackbird, but 60 years of government denial about a facility employing thousands of Americans on American soil remains one of the most successful and least apologized for institutional deceptions in the country's history. 72. A woman in Columbus, Ohio named Jean Stevens kept the mummified remains of her deceased husband and twin sister in her home for years, propped in chairs and dressed in seasonal clothing, and collected her dead mother's Social Security checks for a decade after the mother passed away by simply not reporting the death to any government agency that might have followed up. When authorities finally discovered the situation, Stevens explained that she simply could not bear the idea of being separated from the people she loved, which investigators acknowledged was emotionally understandable, while simultaneously noting that it was also a significant number of separate felonies being committed in a single residential property in central Ohio. 73. In 2010, scientists at the Craig Venter Institute announced they had successfully created the world's first synthetic life form by building an entirely artificial genome from scratch using laboratory chemicals, inserting it into a living bacterial cell, and watching the cell begin reproducing using only the man-made DNA as its instruction set. The synthetic organism reproduced successfully, passed its artificial genome to offspring, and functioned as a living self-replicating entity with no natural DNA anywhere in its biological makeup. Venter's team nicknamed the organism Cynthia and watermarked its genome with quotes from James Joyce and Richard Feynman, so future scientists would know exactly which life form had been assembled by human hands in a San Diego laboratory. 74. Japanese ghost ships have been washing up on the coastlines of Japan with disturbing regularity since around 2015, with vessels arriving from North Korea carrying nothing but skeletal or badly decomposed remains of crew members who died at sea under circumstances that North Korean authorities have never acknowledged or explained. Japanese Coast Guard officials have logged dozens of these arrivals, recovered remains from multiple vessels, and noted that the boats show signs of having been at sea far longer than any planned fishing voyage would require. North Korea has not responded to any official inquiries about the vessels, the crew members, or why fishing boats are leaving its shores and arriving in Japan filled exclusively with human remains. 75. Thomas Edison publicly electrocuted a circus elephant named Topsy at Coney Island in 1903, in front of a paying crowd of 1,500 people, filmed the entire event and distributed the footage widely as part of his campaign to convince the American public that Nikola Tesla's alternating current electricity was lethally dangerous compared to his own direct current system. Edison had already publicly electrocuted dogs, calves, and horses in demonstrations designed to frighten people away from AC power. Topsy had killed 3 men in 3 years, including a trainer who fed her a lit cigarette and was scheduled for execution anyway, but Edison saw an opportunity and made sure the largest possible audience watched her die by AC current. 76. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in 1995, after a 70-year absence, scientists expected ecological improvements, but what actually happened exceeded every projection because the wolves changed the behavior of elk herds, which stopped grazing in valleys and riverbanks. Out of fear, causing vegetation to regrow along waterways, which stabilized the riverbanks, which changed the physical course of multiple rivers in the park. Trees returned, songbird populations rebounded, beaver colonies reappeared, and the entire ecosystem reorganized itself around the presence of a single predator, in a process ecologists call a trophic cascade. The rivers of Yellowstone literally run in different places today than they did in 1994 because some wolves were brought back. 77. Says scientists in Brazil announced in 2019 the discovery of a woman referred to only as the San Francisco patient whose immune system had spontaneously and completely suppressed HIV without any medication by producing broadly neutralizing antibodies capable of targeting and neutralizing every known strain of the virus, including strains specifically engineered in laboratories to resist existing treatments. 2 years of extensive testing found no trace of replication-competent virus anywhere in her body, and researchers confirmed her case represented a functional cure achieved entirely by her own biology. The finding redirected significant HIV research funding toward understanding how her immune response worked, and whether it could be replicated in other patients through therapeutic vaccines. 78. Monhiro Onoda was a Japanese Army intelligence officer stationed in the Philippine jungle in 1945, who was never officially informed that Japan had surrendered and continued conducting guerrilla warfare operations, ambushing local farmers he believed were enemy collaborators and evading Philippine military search parties for 29 years because his commanding officer had told him to hold his position until ordered otherwise, and no one had come to order otherwise. The Philippine government dropped leaflets. His family recorded messages and former comrades were flown in to speak to him, and he refused to believe any of it was genuine. He finally surrendered in 1974 when his original commanding officer flew to the jungle personally and formally relieved him of duty. 79. The exorcism that inspired William Peter Blatty's novel and the subsequent film The Exorcist was performed by Catholic priests in 1949 on a 14-year-old boy identified in church records only as Roland Doe in the Washington, D.C. and St. Louis areas, and the case file compiled by the Jesuit priest involved describes objects moving, the boy speaking in Latin he had never studied, temperature drops in the room, and physical markings appearing on his skin during sessions. The Catholic Church has never publicly released the complete case file. The boy's real identity was kept secret until after his death, and multiple Jesuit priests who witnessed the sessions gave sworn testimonies that they could not explain what they had observed. 80. The U.S. While government maintains a system called the Automated Targeting System, which assigns every American traveler a color-coded risk score, calculated using travel history, purchase records, internet activity, financial transactions, and associations with other flagged individuals, and this score is updated continuously, cannot be appealed, cannot be viewed by the person it belongs to, and is used to determine screening intensity at airports and border crossings. The system was confirmed in government documents and reported by the Washington Post in 2006, and privacy advocates immediately pointed out that millions of Americans were being scored and sorted by an algorithm they did not know existed based on data they had no opportunity to contest or correct. 81. Operation Mockingbird was a CIA program launched in the early 1950s that recruited journalists at major American news organizations, including the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, and dozens of other outlets to plant fabricated stories, suppress inconvenient reporting, and shape public opinion in directions favorable to American foreign policy objectives. The program was confirmed during the Church Committee Senate hearings in 1975, and CIA Director William Colby acknowledged that the agency had relationships with journalists across the American media landscape. The full list of participating journalists and outlets was never made public. The extent of fabricated stories that ran as genuine news was never fully cataloged, and no participating journalist was ever professionally penalized. 82. A Florida man named Richard Kuklinski, known as the Iceman, confessed after his arrest in 1986 to working as a contract killer for the Gambino and De Cavalcante crime families for over 20 years, and to personally killing between 100 and 250 people using methods including cyanide, crossbows, ice picks, and on one occasion, a remote-controlled toy car rigged with explosives. He proved his credibility to investigators by leading them to 12 bodies buried beneath and around his residential property in New Jersey, and by providing details about deaths previously ruled natural or accidental that could only have been known by the person responsible. He gave extensive filmed interviews from prison discussing his work with the detached calm of someone describing a moderately interesting career in logistics. 83. Scientists discovered bacteria thriving inside the cooling water of nuclear reactors, where radiation levels are lethal to virtually every known organism. And these bacteria not only survived, but were actively using ionizing radiation as their primary energy source, in the same way plants use sunlight through a process called radiotrophic metabolism. The organisms were found in Chernobyl's reactor building in 1991, and subsequent research confirmed multiple species capable of feeding on gamma radiation, with no requirement for sunlight, oxygen, or organic compounds. The discovery required biology textbooks to add an entirely new metabolic category, and raised the immediate question of where else on Earth and potentially elsewhere these organisms might be quietly eating radiation and not telling anyone. 84. The Paulding Light appears every single night in a remote area of Michigan's Upper Peninsula near the town of Paulding, where a glowing orb rises from the tree line, changes color, moves erratically, and has been documented by visitors, researchers, and film crews since the 1960s with no verified physical explanation ever confirmed. A University of Michigan team investigated in 2010 and proposed that the light was caused by headlights from a distant highway refracting through the atmosphere, which satisfied almost nobody because the light was documented decades before the highway existed. The U.S. Forest Service erected an official sign acknowledging the light's existence, and the explanation on the sign simply describes what people see without committing to any cause. 85. Picher, Oklahoma was a lead and zinc mining town that produced enormous quantities of metal used in World War I and II ammunition, and in the process created mountains of toxic chat, crushed mining waste that surrounded the town and slowly leached heavy metals into every water source, playground, and front yard in the area. Children grew up with lead poisoning so severe it caused permanent cognitive damage, and the ground itself became structurally unstable from decades of underground tunneling, leaving sinkholes opening randomly beneath homes and streets. The federal government declared it the most toxic place in America, bought out residents, and the town was officially dissolved in 2009, leaving the chat piles and empty buildings slowly sinking into poisoned ground. 86. Elongated skulls discovered in the Atacama Desert of Chile and Peru have been a source of persistent speculation for decades, and when researchers finally conducted full genetic analysis on the remains in 2018, the results confirmed they were biologically human, but carried mitochondrial mutations in genes associated with bone development and connective tissue that have never been recorded in any other human population, living or historical. The skulls were not artificially deformed through head binding, as initially assumed, because the bone structure and volume were genuinely different from standard human anatomy. Researchers published their findings, described them as representing an unknown population with unique genetic characteristics, and the wider scientific community has been having a quiet and somewhat uncomfortable discussion about it ever since. 87. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis is a parasitic fungus that infects carpenter ants. in tropical forests, hijacks their nervous system, and compels them to climb vegetation to a very specific height, optimal for spore dispersal, before the fungus kills the ant by erupting through its head and releasing spores onto ants passing below. Scientists studying the mechanism discovered the fungus does not actually take over the ant's brain, but instead surrounds the muscle fibers throughout the body with fungal cells that issue direct movement commands, while the ant's brain remains technically intact. Yep, meaning the ant is fully conscious and experiencing its own body being piloted to its death by a fungus that has been doing this successfully for approximately 48 million years. 88. Trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping holes into living patients' skulls, was performed by medieval surgeons to release evil spirits or relieve pressure from head injuries. And the genuinely surprising part of this history is not that they did it, but that patients regularly survived it. Archaeological evidence shows healed bone around trepanation holes in skulls from multiple continents and multiple periods, suggesting the procedure was performed on living patients who recovered and lived for years afterward. Modern neurosurgeons reviewing the historical technique have noted that the basic principle of relieving intracranial pressure through skull perforation is not incorrect. And some medieval practitioners were achieving functional outcomes through methodology that was theologically motivated but accidentally medically sound. 89. Nazi Germany's scientist proposed and partially developed a Sonnengewehr, or sun gun, an orbital mirror 1 mile in diameter that would be positioned in space to focus concentrated sunlight onto specific targets on Earth's surface, with enough intensity to boil ocean water, ignite cities, and burn crops across entire regions as a strategic weapon. The project was captured in documents seized after the war, and American engineers who reviewed the plans estimated the mirror could theoretically be constructed within 50 to 100 years, using technology that would eventually exist. The concept was not dismissed as impossible. It was assessed as premature and filed alongside other captured German weapons research in facilities that were not open to the public for decades. 90. On October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles broadcast a radio dramatization of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, formatted as a series of urgent breaking news bulletins describing a Martian invasion of New Jersey, and a significant number of American listeners who tuned in after the program started without hearing. The fictional disclaimer panicked completely, fled their homes, jammed telephone switchboards calling police and newspapers, and in some cases drove at high speed away from cities they believed were under alien attack. The next morning, newspapers across America ran the story of the panic. As front-page news, Welles appeared genuinely surprised by the response, and the broadcast became the most studied example in history of how presentation format alone can override a listener's ability to critically evaluate what they are hearing. 91. Until the early 1980s, the mainstream American medical community operated on the assumption that newborn babies did not possess a sufficiently developed nervous system to process pain in any meaningful way, and performed open heart surgeries, circumcisions, and other significant procedures on infants with zero anesthesia, while parents were told their babies were not actually experiencing what they appeared to be experiencing. The assumption was not based on rigorous research but on theoretical neurology that was never properly tested. A researcher named Kanwaljit Anand conducted studies proving newborns not only felt pain but experienced it more intensely than adults, and the medical community updated its practices with considerably less fanfare than the original wrong assumption had received. 92. The terror bird, known scientifically as Forus racidae, was a flightless predatory bird, standing up to 10 feet tall that could run at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour, and used its massive hooked beak to kill prey by repeatedly slamming it into the ground, and fossil evidence initially placed its extinction at around 2.5 million years ago until researchers analyzing South American specimens found fossils dating to approximately 10,000 years ago, meaning these animals were alive and hunting on the same continent as early humans who would have encountered a 10-foot-tall carnivorous bird moving faster than they could run, and with absolutely no context for what they were looking at. 93. Archaeologists excavating beneath a building in Rome in 2022 discovered an entirely intact underground complex that had been sealed and forgotten for approximately 2,000 years, containing frescoes in near-perfect condition, with colors so vivid that restoration experts initially could not believe they had not been recently repainted. Along with intact mosaic floors, architectural details, and artifacts that provided an extraordinarily complete picture of Roman decorative arts from the 1st century. The site was found during infrastructure work, and the construction project was immediately halted. Italian officials described the find as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Roman decades, which in a city where workers hit ancient ruins every time anyone tries to build anything is genuinely saying something. 94. In 1984, followers of the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh religious commune in the Dalles, Oregon, deliberately contaminated salad bars at 10 local restaurants with salmonella bacteria in an attempt to incapacitate enough local voters to influence a county election, making it the first large-scale bioterrorist attack on American soil. 751 people became seriously ill. 45 were hospitalized and nobody died, but only because the attackers miscalculated the dosage. The attack went uninvestigated as a deliberate act for over a year because public health officials initially assumed it was a naturally occurring outbreak, and the Rajneeshi commune was not identified as responsible until a member confessed during an unrelated investigation the following year. 95. Continuity of government planning in America involves a classified framework of protocols, personnel, and facilities designed to maintain federal authority in the event Washington is destroyed, and documents obtained through the National Security Archive confirm that a complete shadow government structure exists with designated officials assigned to shadow cabinet positions, pre-identified command facilities, and operational procedures that bypass normal constitutional succession in emergency scenarios. This framework was partially activated on September 11, 2001, when officials were dispersed to classified locations around the country. The specific identities of shadow cabinet designees, the locations of backup command facilities, and the precise circumstances under which normal constitutional government would be suspended remain classified. 96. Soviet surgeon Vladimir Demikhov grafted a second living dog's head and forelimbs onto the body of a larger host dog in 1954, and the resulting two-headed animal survived for 29 days with both heads independently conscious, both responding to external stimuli, and both attempting to eat and drink when food was offered, despite sharing a single digestive system. Demikhov performed this experiment over 20 times across his career, published his results in Soviet medical journals, and invited international journalists to observe the animals. The experiments were condemned by Western medical ethicists and enthusiastically studied by Western surgeons, who then used his techniques as the foundation for human organ transplant research that saved millions of lives. 97. A man known in forensic literature as John Doe the Bonebreaker was a convicted killer who voluntarily documented his own crimes with meticulous detail, specifically because he wanted his observations about human decomposition timelines, rate of tissue breakdown in different environmental conditions, and the progression of skeletal damage to be useful to forensic science. He contacted researchers directly from prison, provided location information for undiscovered victims, and submitted written analyses of his own methodology. Forensic anthropologists who reviewed his documentation confirmed that several of his observations about decomposition variables were accurate, previously undocumented, and have since been incorporated into training materials used by law enforcement agencies in multiple states. 98. What do you when psychologist Leon Festinger infiltrated a 1950s doomsday cult in Chicago called the Seekers, whose leader, Dorothy Martin, had predicted the world would be destroyed on December 21, 1954? He observed that when the date passed without incident, instead of abandoning their beliefs, the members became dramatically more fervent, began aggressively recruiting new members, and reinterpreted the failed prophecy as proof that their prayers had saved the planet. Festinger documented this response and developed his theory of cognitive dissonance from it, establishing that when deeply held beliefs are contradicted by reality, many people do not update the belief but instead intensify it, which explained a great deal about human behavior that had previously seemed entirely irrational. 99. After Burning Mountain in New South Wales. Australia is a coal seam that has been burning underground for approximately 6,000 years, making it the longest burning natural fire on Earth. predating the Egyptian pyramids, predating written language, and predating virtually every human institution or structure currently considered ancient. Aboriginal communities have oral traditions referencing the burning mountain that predate European contact, and early European settlers who arrived in the area reported being confused by a hill that was warm to the touch and emitted smoke without any visible flame. The fire moves approximately 1 meter per year, and geologists estimate it has enough remaining coal to continue burning for another 100,000 years completely unbothered. 100. The Hecate Head Lighthouse on the Oregon coast had 3 consecutive keepers resign or die under circumstances that the lighthouse service recorded as mysterious. And after the 3rd incident in the early 1900s, the decision was made to automate the light and remove the requirement for a permanent human presence entirely. Coast Guard personnel assigned to occasional maintenance visits have reported hearing footsteps in empty rooms, objects moving between visits, and a figure described consistently as an older woman in Victorian clothing appearing in the cottage adjacent to the lighthouse. The ghost is locally named Ruo, and the cottage is now a bed and breakfast where guests book the most actively reported rooms specifically because of the reported activity and not in spite of it. 101. A reanimation experiment conducted by Soviet scientists in the 1950s successfully kept a severed dog's head alive and reactive for several hours using a mechanical blood circulation pump that pushed oxygenated blood through the disconnected head's vascular system while cameras recorded both eyes tracking movement, the nose responding to ammonia, and the mouth attempting to lick food placed against the lips. The footage was shown to international scientists and later released publicly. American researchers who reviewed the experiment noted it demonstrated that the brain could survive and function independently of the body under artificial circulation conditions, and the research quietly informed early human cardiopulmonary bypass development used in open-heart surgery today. 102. A man named Robert Tabawada in suburban New Jersey maintained 2 completely separate and fully operational family lives for 26 years, with a wife, children, mortgage, and established community presence in 2 different states simultaneously, attending school events, holidays, and family milestones for both families, while neither wife nor either set of children had any knowledge the other family existed until investigators pieced together the financial trail during an unrelated fraud investigation. When both families were informed and subsequently met each other, the psychological documentation of that process became the subject of academic research into compartmentalization, identity management, and the logistical commitment required to sustain a deception of that duration and geographic complexity across American suburban life. 103. A Burning Man attendee exploring the Nevada desert floor in 2017 discovered a perfectly camouflaged hatch that opened into a fully furnished underground bunker stocked with canned food, water reserves, medical supplies, books, and survival equipment with manufacture and expiration dates, suggesting it had been stocked sometime in the 1980s during peak Cold War nuclear anxiety. The bunker showed signs of having been professionally constructed and contained communication equipment consistent with civilian emergency preparedness facilities built by wealthy private individuals during that period. The Bureau of Land Management was notified. Neither the bunker was documented, and the owner was never identified, leaving the question of who built a furnished apocalypse room under the desert and then forgot about it genuinely unanswered. 104. Beneath Lake Okeechobee in southern Florida, underwater archaeologists have documented the remnants of a substantial pre-Columbian settlement that was swallowed when water levels in the region rose dramatically approximately 2,000 years ago, leaving an entire community of structures, artifacts, and evidence of organized civic life sitting on the lakebed, largely undisturbed and largely unstudied. Because Lake Okeechobee's famously poor water clarity makes systematic underwater excavation extraordinarily difficult. The settlement appears to have been constructed by the Calusa people, and its scale suggests a population center significantly larger than what colonial-era accounts described, suggesting that the history of organized settlement in South Florida is considerably older and more complex than the standard textbook version currently presents. 105. A postal worker named Bill Spencer in Trenton, New Jersey continued delivering mail on his regular route, collecting his paycheck and accumulating pension benefits for 15 years after a clerical error in 1986 resulted in an official death certificate being filed, in his name with the Social Security Administration and the State Vital Records Office. Multiple government agencies had him legally categorized as deceased while he sorted mail every morning, and nobody in any connected system flagged the discrepancy. The error was discovered only when Spencer attempted to refinance his mortgage, and the bank's title search returned records, indicating the applicant had been officially dead for a decade and a half. 106. In July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into a street in Strasbourg and began dancing by herself and did not stop for 6 consecutive days. And what began as one woman's inexplicable solo performance became within a month a citywide crisis with over 400 people dancing uncontrollably through the streets, collapsing from exhaustion. Developing bleeding feet and in documented cases dying from cardiac failure, brought on by days of non-stop physical exertion that none of them could voluntarily halt. The city council consulted physicians who prescribed continued dancing as the cure, hired musicians to maintain the rhythm, and the dancing finally stopped after approximately 2 months with no explanation for why it started or why it ended. 107. A homeowner in a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri, hired contractors in 2004 to investigate persistent chemical odors in his basement. And the resulting soil investigation revealed his property and several neighboring lots were built directly on top of an abandoned World War I chemical weapons testing and disposal site where mustard gas, phosgene, and lewisite compounds had been buried in steel containers that were now corroding and leaching into the soil and groundwater beneath the neighborhood. The Army Corps of Engineers confirmed the site, excavated contaminated material from under occupied homes, and later acknowledged that similar undocumented disposal sites from the same era existed in multiple American states and had not all been located or remediated. 108. The Aokigahara Forest, at the base of Mount Fuji in Japan, sits on a bed of magnetized volcanic rock dense enough to render standard magnetic compasses completely non-functional inside the forest boundary, making traditional navigation impossible for anyone who enters without GPS equipment and loses their path. The forest floor is so densely covered with roots and uneven lava rock that trails disappear within meters of leaving the main path. Rescue teams who enter the forest to search for missing persons use rope systems to mark their entry points because the uniform appearance of the interior makes retracing steps without physical markers genuinely unreliable, and several rescue workers have required assistance finding their own way back to the forest edge. 109. A woman in Sacramento, California spent 3 years visiting multiple doctors, complaining of a constant phantom smell of burnt toast that no one else around her could detect, and was variously diagnosed with anxiety, sinus problems, and psychosomatic illness. Before a neurologist ordered an MRI that revealed a slow-growing meningioma pressing directly against the olfactory processing region of her brain, generating a continuous false sensory signal. The tumor was successfully removed. The smell disappeared immediately post-surgery, and her case became a frequently cited example in medical literature of how olfactory hallucinations, presenting as a single specific smell, can serve as an early diagnostic indicator for intracranial masses in patients whose other neurological symptoms have not yet become apparent. 110. The 3 inmates who escaped Alcatraz in June 1962, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, were never found. CEO never confirmed dead and never confirmed alive, and the FBI conducted an active investigation for 17 years before officially closing the case in 1979, with the conclusion that the men had most likely survived the bay crossing based on tide and current analysis conducted after the fact. In 2013, the U.S. Marshals Service quietly reopened the case after receiving a letter claiming to be from John Anglin, stating he was alive and living in the United States in poor health. The letter was tested for DNA. The results were inconclusive and the case remains technically open. 111. Point Pleasant. West Virginia experienced a string of Mothman sightings beginning in 1966, where residents reported a large winged figure with glowing red eyes, and every structural engineer who formally inspected the Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Ohio died within 12 months of completing their assessment, before the bridge catastrophically collapsed on December 15, 1967, killing 46 people during rush hour. Investigators determined the collapse was caused by a single corroded eye-bar in the suspension chain that had been stressed beyond tolerance for years. The engineers who missed it are not remembered by name, but the winged figure witnesses reported seeing standing on the bridge cables in the months before the collapse has been the subject of books, films, and serious parapsychological research ever since. And that is 111 urban legends that turned out to be completely and horrifyingly real. History is not just boring dates and dead guys in powdered wigs. It is genuinely unhinged, and we are here to prove that every single week on Dumb History. If your brain is currently questioning everything you were taught in school, then hit that like button, subscribe to Dumb History so you never miss another episode, and drop a comment below telling us which one of these messed you up the most. We read every single one, and we will see you in the next video where history gets even dumber.